Hey folks, tonight we drift through stone corridors slick with candle wax and echoing with faint Gregorian chants. The hour is late, the stars flicker above old cloisters and behind heavy wooden doors. Medieval monks begin their true routines, not always what you'd expect. The scent of old parchment mingles with spiced mead, and silent vows are sometimes broken with soft laughter or a clink of a secret flask. As the abbey dozes, some monks slip quietly through shadows, tending to habits less holy than they appear. Before we get too comfortable, do me a small favor. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always nice knowing who else is awake in the quiet hours. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The monastery clock strikes midnight well. Actually, no such thing. Most medieval monks didn't have clocks as we know them. Instead, a groggy brother would shuffle into the cold chapel to ring the bell by hand, signaling matins, the first of 7 daily prayers. But not every monk answered the call. Some lingered. Behind thick stone walls and tucked away chambers, secrets bloomed. Quiet laughter, not quite loud enough to echo. Crumbs from forbidden treats brushed hastily off robes. A few candles stayed burning, despite the rule of darkness. You might imagine a monk as a stoic, chaste, cloistered man, untouched by earthly desires. But under those itchy robes, humans stirred curious, hungry, flawed. In some abbeys, the kitchens didn't close when the sun went down. In fact, that's exactly when they got busy. A sly lay brother or 2 monks who weren't fully ordained but worked behind the scenes might pull crusty bread from a still warm hearth, dab cheese on it, and sneak it into a little basket. That basket would then vanish into a stairwell or slip behind a curtain in the dormitory. Some monasteries even had what you'd call an underground economy. Monks bartered favors. I'll do your copying if you sneak me some of that quince jam. Pilgrims left gifts at the gates. Dates, wine, trinkets, all meant to please God. But somehow, these gifts often ended up stashed in a brother's private nook. One monk in France wrote guiltily of a full roast chicken, lovingly salted and hidden under a cot. A temptation sent to test me, he called it, more likely. Tuesday supper. Silence was expected at night, but not always kept. Imagine, in a long dormitory of straw-stuffed mattresses, one monk slowly sits up. He checks the room most brothers snore gently. He tiptoes to a small window ledge, where a note waits beneath a rock. In a world without texting, monks still found ways to DM each other. Little scrolls of parchment, rolled and tied with thread, exchanged hands like gossip in a school hallway. One English monastery had to ban monks from sliding notes between library books. The rule books were clear. No talking after Cumberland, the last prayer before bed. But clever monks learned the art of the non-verbal conversation. One raised eyebrow could say, "You owe me a turn at the hidden honeypot." A subtle cough might mean, "The abbot's coming. Hide the cheese." Entire sign languages evolved in strict orders, originally to preserve silence, but over time, used more for subtle mischief. And then there were the night owls, the monks who genuinely didn't want to sleep. These were the thinkers, the dreamers, the restless souls who found their best thoughts came under starlight. One might sneak into the cloister garden to smell the damp earth and talk softly to himself. Another might wander into the chapel and practice silent chants, not for prayer, but because the acoustics pleased him. We picture these abbeys as quiet, static places, but they were often filled with low-level chaos after dark. Imagine hearing the soft plink of a lute string from the cellar, or discovering that someone had carved a surprisingly well-detailed chicken into the choir stall during last week's prayers. Monastic punishment for minor rule-breaking was rarely severe, but always clever. One brother in Italy, caught sneaking raisins at night, was ordered to fast for 2 days. Another, who laughed during matins, had to copy out the Psalms backwards. and woe to the monk caught sleepwalking into the nun's quarter. Let's just say, his duties afterward involved a lot of dishwashing and no wine for a year. Still, despite the rules, the secrets, and the late-night nonsense, monks were people trying their best. Most truly wanted peace, discipline, and a sense of closeness to God. But when you lock dozens of humans together in stone walls for life, strange things are bound to happen after the sun goes down. The Abbey, in many ways, was like a medieval high school with fewer hormones and more incense. There were cliques. There were pranks. There were teachers' pets, and the one guy who always volunteered for extra penance to make everyone else look bad. And just like anywhere else, nighttime was when personalities unfurled quietly under cover of candlelight. So if you'd wandered into a monastery courtyard around 1:30 a.m., you might have seen nothing. Or you might have glimpsed a hunched shape slipping between shadows, a robe fluttering, the faint scent of honeyed wine trailing behind. And as you tucked yourself into a straw mattress, eyes heavy, you might have wondered, what other secrets were being whispered in the stone halls tonight? The sun may have been hours from rising, but inside the Abbey's scriptorium, flickering candles cast dancing shadows across thick vellum pages. The smell of parchment, soot, and drying ink filled the air like a strange perfume. Somewhere in that echoing room sat Brother Aldwin, his fingers stained purple from the ink pot, his breath puffing faint clouds in the cold. He was supposed to be copying a sacred homily, but his mind had wandered again, specifically to the whereabouts of the monastery's best bottle of wine. Scriptoriums were quiet places, sacred, in fact. They were where monks transcribed scripture, illuminated letters with golden ink, and preserved the past. But they were also gossip factories, silent ones. Here, monks passed information with pointed glances and dramatic sighs. Brother Cedric's candle was always mysteriously brighter than everyone else's. Was he hoarding better wax? Brother Milo's quill never splintered. Maybe he was sneaking into the carpentry shed for superior wood. And of course, there was the cheese incident of St. Hildreth's Day. No one knew who started the rumor, but by the end of the week, it was whispered in every corner of the cloister. Someone had stolen the abbot's prized blue cheese from the guest larder. One monk claimed to have seen a greasy fingerprint on the stone shelf. Another swore the culprit left behind a trail of crumbs, evidence enough, really, for a minor inquisition. Wine, however, was the true currency. While not forbidden, it was regulated. Each monk received a set portion, measured carefully. But portions could mysteriously shift. The cellar keeper, often a lay brother with a generous streak and a taste for drama, became a minor king. A wink could earn you an extra swig. A favor traded at matins might be redeemed with a corked bottle by the weekend. Of course, it wasn't all scandal. Many monks genuinely loved their work in the scriptorium. Brother Stephen, for instance, had never touched wine in his life, but filled the margins of his manuscripts with doodles, frogs playing trumpets, saints juggling apples, even the occasional knight being bitten by a giant snail. These weren't random distractions. They were quiet acts of rebellion. After all, life in the monastery could be crushingly dull. Who wouldn't want to give a crusader a snail nemesis? Illumination, the art of decorating manuscripts, was technically encouraged. But the line between art and monkey in a bishop's hat was blurry. In some scriptoria, the abbots eventually had to issue formal bans on certain themes. One famous rulebook from a Benedictine order banned images of rabbits engaged in human conversation. You know there's a story behind that. Let's not forget the bookbinders, the unsung heroes of the scriptorium. Their job involved pressing, folding, stitching, and gluing, sometimes for 12 hours straight. One monk in 1283 reportedly fell asleep with his forehead stuck to a drawing page and woke up with the word Amen mirrored on his face. They called him Brother Amen for the rest of his life. He didn't mind. Said it saved him from answering to his real name, Benedict the Younger, which was already taken by 3 other monks. Sometimes, sacred texts weren't the only things being copied. A traveling friar might bring in a strange poem or tale from the outside world, a story of distant lands, mythical beasts, or a scandal involving a local bishop. If the tale had just enough moral messaging, it could be copied for educational purposes. And once it was on parchment, it became part of the monastery's lore. Of course, this meant that over time, the abbey libraries quietly ballooned into sprawling, chaotic collections. Officially, they housed only religious materials. Unofficially, well, if you knew where to look, you could find everything from folk songs to diagrams of catapults. One monk was said to have secretly illustrated an entire guide to indoor gardening for introverts. It was discovered years later behind a wall panel, stuffed with dried herbs and a surprisingly smug-looking basil plant drawn in the corner. But perhaps the most delicate activity in the scriptorium wasn't copying sacred texts or doodling squirrels in battle. It was copying letters. Not official ones, of course. These were personal. One might be a carefully worded message to a monk's family, which technically wasn't forbidden, but wasn't exactly encouraged either. Another might be something closer to a love letter, veiled, full of allegory, always wrapped in verses about longing, stars, or divine beauty. Some monks, you see, fell in love, not always romantically, but deeply, with ideas, with music, with beauty, with the person who sat beside them in the pews every day. The human heart isn't bound by stone walls or morning bells. It wanders, even while transcribing Leviticus. These letters were often hidden inside book covers or rolled tightly and stuffed into candle bases. There's even a record of a monk who hollowed out a loaf of bread, inserted a note, and passed it to a visiting nun under the pretense of gifted sustenance. Historians call it smuggling. I call it creative delivery. And while most of these messages were never discovered, a few were. The punishments were sometimes harsh transfers to stricter abbeys, loss of writing privileges, but sometimes they were just brushed aside. After all, even abbots understood loneliness. So, while the world outside the abbey slept inside those walls, the minds of monks wandered, by candlelight, in silence, with quills scratching like tiny whispers. The scribes of the medieval world gave us knowledge, mystery, and occasionally a tiny drawing of a goose fighting a dragon. It was a strange blend, sacred duty and deeply human distraction. And that balance, that delicate tug of war between holy focus and whispered curiosity, that's what made the monastery scriptorium one of the most quietly scandalous rooms in medieval history. The bells rang with precision, echoing through stone corridors like a gentle scolding, reminding everyone to keep their minds on heaven and their eyes off the herb garden. But after weeks of copying the same psalms and eating the same lentil mush, even the most pious monk developed quirks. You might call them hobbies. The abbots called them unregulated enthusiasms. Either way, boredom in a medieval monastery was a powerful force, and monks found plenty of odd ways to fill the gaps. Take Brother Theobald, for instance. He had a deep, almost mystical relationship with his pet squirrel, which he kept tucked into the sleeve of his robe. Technically, animals weren't forbidden, as long as they served a purpose. Dogs helped with guarding. Cats kept the mice at bay. But Theobald's squirrel? Purely emotional support. He named it Felix, after a saint, and trained it to steal fruit from the refectory when no one was looking. Then there was Brother Martin, who invented an elaborate game involving snail shells, pebbles, and prayers. The rules were never written down, but other monks described it as a combination of chess, divine chants, and very quiet muttering. He swore the game brought him closer to God. Most others suspected it just gave him an excuse to skip dish duty. Hobbies were a sort of unofficial therapy. In a world of constant repetition, monks needed creative outlets. Some turned to garden design, planting herbs in precise geometric patterns that rivaled royal palaces. Others became obsessed with beekeeping, not for honey, but for the calming buzz. One monk in Bavaria named all his bees after apostles and claimed they responded to their names. Judas was a bit of a biter, he admitted in his journal. And then, of course, there was Brother Paul, who began carving tiny furniture, not life-size doll size. No one knew why. He never spoke of it. But over time, his collection grew. Miniature pews, lecterns, and even a tiny abbot's chair complete with a carved frown. Eventually, he created a full model of the entire abbey out of walnut and beeswax. It was kept in the cellar, presumably for planning purposes. The monks weren't allowed to speak during meals, but they developed a full-blown sign language to communicate anyway. Originally meant for essential tasks, pass the salt, please more turnips, it quickly expanded. Gestures evolved for gossip, jokes, and even passive aggression. One particularly theatrical monk could communicate. Brother Osmond left the bathhouse without rinsing, using just 3 quick hand motions and a raised eyebrow. This was life under the rule of Saint Benedict, a document that guided monastic life with loving rigidity. The rule told monks when to wake, when to sleep, when to eat, and when to pray. But it didn't mention origami, vegetable carving, or obsessive bird watching, so those became loopholes. You'd find monks perched by windows, watching swallows and sketching them in the margins of their prayer books. For some, the obsession was with weather. Brother Elias, a Cistercian with too much time on his hands, recorded the sky's every mood for 14 years. Misty with intent, he once described a morning fog. Suspiciously cheerful, he wrote of an unseasonably warm February. His notes, found centuries later, are now used by modern climatologists. But at the time, most just thought he was dodging dishwashing duty. Some hobbies were borderline mischievous. Take Brother Adalbert's shadow puppets. By candlelight, he could make wolves, angels, or his favorite 2 abbots arguing over soup. It was all fun and shadows until the real abbot walked in on a very detailed puppet show of the last council meeting. Adalbert was reassigned to root cellar inventory for a month. He called it a tragic misuse of his talents. Then there were the monks who took a more practical route, inventing things. One created a self-watering plant system using goat bladders and gravity. Another designed a wheel-powered spit for roasting meat, even though the order was vegetarian. In case of guests, he insisted. Guests never came. The spit is still preserved in a museum in Spain. Of course, not every hobby was welcome. Some crossed lines. A brother in southern France became obsessed with making perfume using herbs from the abbey garden. Harmless at first, until someone accused him of seducing the novices with his sensual mint tones. He was ordered to burn his oils. He did, but not before bottling one last vial labeled Saintly Temptation. To the outsider, all of this might sound irreverent or silly, but for monks living under strict vows, small joys became sacred. A perfectly carved turnip, a beetle kept as a pet, a joke whispered during wood-chopping duty. These things broke up the monotony, made the silence bearable, and gave shape to long days that otherwise bled into one another. Even prayer could become a kind of hobby. Some monks composed their own chants, setting psalms to new melodies in secret. One was caught humming an original tune during Vespers. When reprimanded, he claimed the melody came to him in a dream sent by Saint Cecilia herself. The abbot didn't buy it. He was assigned to clean candle molds for the next 6 months, but continued humming while he worked. The beauty of monastic life was its stillness. But in that stillness, the human mind bubbled with curiosity, humor, and just enough rebellion to stay sane. These hobbies weren't distractions. They were survival. They gave monks a way to express identity in a world where uniformity reigned. And sometimes, just sometimes, they made life a little more interesting than the daily liturgy would admit. So the next time you imagine a monk quiet, prayerful, lost in scripture, remember, he might also be mentally naming his bees, carving a chair for a mouse, or planning a new snail shell tournament. And honestly, can you blame him? Rules were everything in a medieval monastery. The day began and ended with them. And in between, they marched alongside every thought and action like an ever-present chaperone. But here's the curious part. Monks, those cloaked emblems of piety, became masters of following the rules in the most wonderfully inventive, gloriously subversive ways. They obeyed the letter, yes. But the spirit? Well, that was negotiable. Take fasting, for instance. One of the pillars of monastic life. Monks were expected to abstain from meat on many days and to eat frugally, especially during Lent. But what counted as meat? That was up for debate. Fish, of course, was allowed, but so were beavers. Yes, beavers. Because some clever cleric once declared that since a beaver's tail was scaly and aquatic, it must count as a fish. Problem solved. Monks dined on roasted beaver tail while claiming religious compliance. That's what you might call sainthood with sauce. Similarly, the vow of silence was taken very seriously. Until it wasn't. The rules said monks couldn't speak. It didn't say anything about humming, coughing in Morse code, or developing elaborate gestural languages with dramatic flair. In one particularly inventive abbey, the monks created over 200 hand signals, including specific gestures for "pass the onions," "the abbot's behind you," and "Brother Godfrey is asleep again." The silence remained unbroken technically. The mischief? Alive and well. Then there was the loophole Olympics surrounding sleep. Monks weren't allowed to nap during the day, as sloth was frowned upon. But what if you just happened to be meditating while lying completely horizontal? Or praying in repose? A well-placed blanket over the face could conceal a snooze that lasted through an entire afternoon. One monk was rumored to have perfected the art of sleep prayer so well, he once snored through matins and still received compliments on his deep contemplative stillness. The monastery schedule, structured down to the minute, was also ripe for manipulation. Duties rotated, but not all were created equal. Working in the garden was preferred over the latrines. The kitchens were warmer than the stone hallways. So monks began quietly trading tasks. "I'll copy 3 psalms for you if you scrub Brother Gerald's sandals. Let me ring the bells tonight, and I'll fill in a chapel for you next week." It became a silent barter system, and everyone knew who the best negotiators were. Brother Anselm, for instance, hadn't swept a corridor in 4 years. Even sacred rituals weren't immune to creative bending. One abbey permitted the drinking of small amounts of wine during feast days. But what exactly counted as a feast day? Over time, minor saints became extremely popular, with obscure martyrs suddenly enjoying enthusiastic veneration. Today is Saint Quirinus of Neuss, a monk might say brightly. He's the patron saint of, well, we're still researching, but I believe it involves fermented grapes. And while abstinence was central to monastic vows, certain loopholes made room for peculiar indulgences. Brother Hugo, a fastidious rule follower on paper, became infamous for his bath time rituals. The rule allowed for regular bathing, as needed for health. Hugo, it turned out, had very demanding hygiene. His weekly medical soaks included scented herbs, heated tiles, and occasionally soft singing. No one dared question him. He had memorized every health clause in the abbey's medical codex. Then there were feast day performances. Some monasteries permitted light entertainment to celebrate God's bounty. Monks took this and ran with it. Plays were written, puppets carved, masks painted. One particularly ambitious script involved a talking sheep sent by the Lord to critique poor soup recipes. The abbot was not amused, but the crowd? Absolutely delighted. These little rebellions weren't necessarily malicious. In fact, they were often the only way monks could retain a sense of self within a highly regulated world. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't account for the itch of boredom, the pull of laughter, or the particular craving for honey past midnight. The monks weren't breaking the rules, they were dancing along the edge, a sort of sacred mischief wrapped in prayer robes. And sometimes the bending went deeper into the realm of silent protest. Take Brother Roland, who never openly defied authority, but spent years subtly sabotaging the Abbey's rainwater collection system. Why? Because he believed it unfairly favored the northern dormitories, and he lived in the south wing. Over time, his strategic nudging of drain spouts and silent nighttime adjustments rerouted water to balance things out. Justice by way of plumbing. Another brother, Wilfred, was infamous for reading heretical texts in the library. Not openly, of course. He would hide the forbidden manuscript inside a perfectly acceptable psalter and flip between the pages as needed. When caught, he claimed honestly that he was studying the Psalms. "I never said only the Psalms," he added with a shrug. Even food rules got the gentle treatment. The kitchen staff found that soaking stale bread in wine technically made it easier to chew and, by happy coincidence, got them tipsy. The abbot eventually banned the practice after several monks sang the wrong hymns in perfect harmony. But here's the thing. These weren't acts of rebellion in the modern sense. They were acts of survival. Ways to preserve dignity, joy, and personality in a life designed to erase ego. In their cleverness, monks found freedom. They could obey and still smirk behind the veil of discipline. And through it all, they stayed deeply committed to their faith. These were not shallow men. They wrestled with guilt, with temptation, with the enormity of belief. Their mischief didn't make them less holy. It made them more human. And in many cases, their moments of quiet rebellion revealed a deeper truth. That even in structures built for obedience, the soul seeks to wiggle free now and then. So the next time you imagine a monk kneeling in silent prayer, eyes closed and lips still, just picture his fingers twitching with the desire to doodle, or the memory of a squirrel in his sleeve. The sacred and the silly coexisted, sometimes in the same breath. And if that's not divine comedy, what is? Beneath the monastery's hallowed arches, where incense hung heavy and prayers drifted skyward like warm breath on a cold morning, another scent sometimes crept through the air-roasted onions, spiced meat, and something distinctly forbidden. Not every meal was humble porridge. Not every monk fasted with the fervor of a saint. Because deep in the abbey kitchens, behind the clang of copper pots and the polite shuffle of sandals, there were feasts unofficial, unrecorded, and absolutely delicious. The rule books were strict about meals. 2 a day. No meat from 4-legged animals. Simple fare. Bread, beans, greens, and on feast days, perhaps a bit of cheese or fish. But monks were nothing if not resourceful, and more than a few developed a knack for creative interpretation. After all, if it was boiled enough and sprinkled with herbs, could you really call it indulgent? Take Brother Thaddeus, a monastery cook. Officially, he followed the dietary rules with dutiful care. But unofficially, he was an artist. He devised dishes that technically obeyed the rule, but tasted like sin. Lentil stews that bubbled with secret bone broth. Fish pies that contained an alarming number of ingredients that swam only in imagination. And for the right favor say, a replacement shift in the library, he'd share a slice of his honeyed oat tart, served warm behind the scullery door. The abbey had 2 kitchens, the official one for communal meals, and a much smaller, often hidden one used only on rare occasions, or by monks who needed a place to cook privately donated goods. This smaller kitchen was known as Little Hell in one cloister, not because of the heat, but because anything cooked there had a whiff of guilt attached. It was a place for stolen jam, for the sausage a pilgrim had gifted in confidence, or for the occasional roast eel donated by a grateful peasant. So many donations, so little accountability. But perhaps the most curious part wasn't the food, it was the infrastructure. Some abbeys had hidden pantries. Not secret in the sense of trapdoors and torch-lit tunnels, but hidden in plain sight, behind shelves, beneath stairs, or inside alcoves disguised as broom storage. In one case, a monk discovered a loose stone behind the wine rack. He tugged and found an entire alcove filled with dried figs, ale, and a wheel of Gouda older than most novices. Why so much secrecy? Because not every monk could resist temptation, and not every abbot approved of rich flavor profiles. The more zealous among the leadership believed too much culinary joy risked pulling attention from God. Brother Marcus, for example, was once found whispering over a stew pot, literally whispering to it, as though coaxing it into divine flavor. He claimed it helped him focus. The abbot did not agree. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks eating only boiled turnips. But oh, how the monks longed for the forbiddens. One monastery in northern France recorded over 12 instances of bread smuggling monks, sneaking crusty loaves back to their cells after supper. The abbot issued a scathing sermon on gluttony. That same week, someone left a sausage link dangling from the bell rope. It was never claimed. Historians still wonder. And then there were feast days. Officially holy, often solemn. Unofficially, a culinary jailbreak. The day before would be full of fasting. Yes, but behind the scenes, preparations buzzed. Candied nuts soaked in wine. Fruit pies sealed in jars. Beer chilled in a cold spring basin. When the feast day came, the monks sang hymns with unusually full bellies and slightly rosier cheeks. Of course, the abbot had to maintain order. Too much celebration looked suspicious, but most knew when to look away. One record from a Benedictine abbey describes an abbot who fell suddenly ill with headaches. Every St. Martin's Day, coincidentally the same day the monks brewed mulled wine and played dice in the herb garden. He always recovered the next morning, as if by miracle. One of the most extravagant hidden feasts in monastic lore involved a roast peacock. Yes, a peacock. Beautiful, extravagant, utterly off limits. And yet, it appeared on the table of the southern refectory one snowy December night. Where it came from, no one knew. The novice who found the feathers under his cot swore he had no idea. No one confessed. The incident went unpunished, but for weeks afterward, a faint smell of rosemary and bird fat clung to the stones. But not all secret meals were extravagant. Some were about comfort. A monk might hoard a small jar of honey, spooning it out one fingerful at a time while staring into candlelight. Another might wrap a bit of cheese in linen and keep it under his cot, guarding it like treasure. These were humble rebellions, quiet affirmations that life could still hold sweetness, even under vows of denial. And then there were the drinkers. Monks brewed their own ale and wine, not just for pleasure, but because clean water was often scarce. Brewing was an act of preservation, of survival, but some took it further. Entire monastic orders became famous for their beer, rich, dark, warming. One monk wrote in his journal, "It is like drinking bread and sunlight." Another called it liquid prayer. A third was found asleep in the grain barrel, smiling. Late-night drinking wasn't common, but it happened. A bottle passed around during scriptorium duty. A cup shared in the bell tower, soft giggles echoing through stone halls. One monastery had to formally ban festive hymn singing after Vespers. The implication? Too many impromptu concerts following generous portions of elderberry wine. Still, all these quiet indulgences, the feasts, the snacks, the forbiddens roasts, weren't really signs of failure. They were signs of life. Monks, despite everything, were men with cravings, with taste buds, with moments of weakness and joy. And when the abbey walls echoed with laughter after a shared tart or secret sausage, perhaps God understood. Perhaps holiness could stretch, just a little, to make room for a second helping. Because sometimes sanctity comes not just in prayer and sacrifice, but in the perfect, golden crisp of a secretly toasted bun. Some monks never wrote their names. Others never left the monastery walls. But just a few left behind whispers of something forbidden, pressed gently between pages of psalms and tucked beneath folds of habit cloth. Letters. Secret, poetic, painfully human letters. Tonight, we slip into the candlelit world of quiet longing, hidden ink, and the scandalous art of monastic affection. You see, monks weren't supposed to write personal messages, especially ones expressing love. Their hearts, like their time, belong to God. And yet the heart wanders softly, stubbornly, even in cloisters designed to erase desire. The earliest letters we know of weren't confessions of forbidden romance exactly, but they weren't entirely innocent either. A note from a 13th century German monk survives, addressed to an unnamed brother of great beauty and clarity of soul. That sounds spiritual enough until you read the part about the dream they shared under the apple tree. In many cases, monks used veiled metaphors. Love was a garden, or a melody, or a candle that wouldn't extinguish. One clever monk wrote an entire ode to a holy flame that warmed his heart only when a certain angel was nearby. He slipped the parchment into a hymnal, folded like a prayer. It was found 300 years later, still faintly scented with dried lavender pressed inside. Where did these letters go? Nowhere, usually. They were passed hand to hand or hidden in shared workspaces. Sometimes they were never meant to be delivered at all. A monk might simply write what he could not say, and burn it, or bury it in the garden. Writing, after all, was the only safe kind of speaking. But some letters did reach their destination. Visiting monks from other abbeys sometimes carried messages disguised as copied verses, tucked into prayer scrolls or hidden behind wax seals. In one recorded case, a friar unknowingly carried a love letter written by a young scribe named Aldrich. It was meant for a nun in a nearby convent, and it simply read, "Your voice remains in the echo of the bells. I wait for it every day." How many more messages were exchanged under the guise of theology? How many psalters carried more than just prayers? And it wasn't just about romantic longing. Sometimes the letters were about family. A monk who missed his sister. One who wrote to a brother in the army. They couldn't always send them, but they wrote them anyway, ink on vellum, hearts on sleeves. It was the writing that mattered, the whisper into the silence. Other letters were more playful. One monk devised a system of code replacing common words with Latin bird names to hide flirtations in plain sight. "The hawk lands near the rosemary" sounds like bird watching, until you realize the hawk was Brother Jerome, and the rosemary was the laundry courtyard where he always prayed alone. The abbey never figured it out. Centuries later, historians did. The fear of discovery was real. Letters meant punishment, sometimes reassignment, sometimes public confession. A monk caught exchanging messages could be banned from the scriptorum or denied communion for weeks. In one abbey, the entire cloister was put under silent penance for 3 days after an unsigned letter was found in the choir stall. It contained a single line, "Your hand brushed mine." It was enough to ruin sleep. Not all were beautiful. Some letters were bitter, jealous, desperate. One novice wrote a furious note to a senior brother who ignored him after weeks of shared gardening duty. "You turned your prayers elsewhere. May they comfort you." He never signed it. The letter was found centuries later inside a hollowed-out psalter cover. It's important to understand, these weren't soap opera affairs. They weren't always physical. In most cases, they weren't even spoken aloud. They were connections. Tiny acts of rebellion against the crushing sameness of cloistered life. A reminder that beneath the uniform robes beat individual hearts hungry for love, for being seen, for knowing they mattered to someone else. Sometimes, the letters weren't even meant for others. A monk might write to God in the most intimate tones, a tone that blurred the line between devotion and desire. "You are my morning hunger and my night's ache," wrote one monk in a hidden journal, found centuries later beneath the abbey floorboards. Some called it blasphemous. Others found it moving. There were even cases of monks writing to saints in passionate prose, using the language of love to reach across the divide. One wrote to Saint Agnes, "Let your purity wash me. Your eyes find me in my exile." Was it prayer? Was it yearning? Perhaps both. Of course, not everyone approved. Abbots occasionally gave stern sermons, warning against emotional attachments that bind the soul to earthly comfort. But emotion wasn't something you could ban with a bell. So it slipped through the cracks, curled around candle flames, and bled softly into inked letters. Some monks wrote poems instead, safer, if they could claim it was devotional. Others kept entire journals, writing only at night when the cloister slept. And some, like Brother Lucian of Bruges, filled the margins of his books with tiny coded phrases. His laugh rings like silver. He walks as though holding sunlight. He does not know I watch him. The books remain. His name is remembered not for heresy, but for humanity. So if you picture a monk bent over a desk, eyes low, quill in hand, know this. He might be copying sacred text, or he might be pouring out a heart full of longing, folded quietly into metaphor. His love might never be returned, never even seen. But still he writes, still he hopes, still he loves in silence. While most monks lived out their vows in quiet rhythm bells, prayers, chores, and silence, not all of them managed to stay the course. Some, pushed by frustration, temptation, or plain wanderlust, did the unthinkable. They ran, escaped, slipped out past the abbey walls and vanished into the world beyond. These were the runaway monks, and their stories, while whispered, were never truly forgotten. To leave a monastery wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was considered spiritual treason. Monks took a lifelong vow of stability, meaning they promised to stay within their community until death. The cloister was supposed to be their whole world. To abandon it was to reject not just the rules, but God's will itself. Still, the urge to flee simmered in many. Perhaps it was the cold, the endless winter mornings spent in unheated chapels, toes numb, stomachs growling. Or maybe it was the crushing silence. Some monks simply couldn't stand never speaking their minds. Others longed for color, music, loved things that no illuminated manuscript could truly provide. And so they planned. Escapes weren't traumatic, like in the movies. No daring rooftop leaps or midnight horse chases. Most simply, walked away. After evening prayer, during herb gathering duty, or under the pretext of fetching water. They slipped off into the woods, or followed a dusty pilgrim road until the abbey bell was too distant to hear. Some took only the robes on their backs. Others carried secret stashes, cheese wrapped in cloth, a flask of wine, maybe even a purloined psalter, as both reading and protection. One particularly bold monk, Brother Alaric, was said to have stolen the abbot's best boots before leaving. A petty act? Perhaps, but he walked to Paris in them. Where did they go? Some tried to blend in with traveling pilgrims. Others headed for cities, hoping to pass as scribes, musicians, or laborers. A few sought out other monasteries and begged for forgiveness, starting over under new names. It was a risky gamble. News traveled slowly, but not that slowly. And the monastic world, while vast, was close-knit. One novice fleeing a monastery in York was recognized in a Canterbury abbey 6 months later by the shape of his ears. And when they were caught, punishments varied. The rule of Saint Benedict was clear. A monk who fled must be shunned, then forgiven, and if he fled again, punished more harshly. Some were confined to their cells for weeks, others forced into humiliating duties, like cleaning latrines or scrubbing chamber pots with bare hands. In the worst cases, chains were used, not to imprison, exactly, but to remind. One record from a 14th century Spanish abbey tells of a runaway monk who was brought back, given a warm meal, and then fitted with a discreet iron ring around his ankle, just loose enough to allow walking, but too heavy to forget. A burden equal to his soul's weight, the abbot said. Yet despite the consequences, monks still fled. Sometimes not just once, but over and over. Brother Hugo of Normandy ran away 3 times. Each time he was dragged back. On the 4th attempt, he disappeared completely. Some said he joined a troupe of traveling actors. Others claimed he became a pirate on the channel. The truth? Lost to history. But in the margins of a monastery chronicle, someone scribbled, "Hugo laughed like the sea." There's also the strange story of Brother Remigius, a monk who vanished during Vespers and returned 7 years later, older, thinner, and covered in scars. He refused to say where he'd been. He rejoined the order silently, worked harder than anyone, and never missed a prayer again. His fellow monks whispered tales of desert hermits, bandits, and even a cursed forest, but he never spoke a word. When he died, his journal contained only a single line. "I found no peace outside the wall, but I carried it back with me." Not all runaways fled forever. Some simply needed to see if the world held what they thought they were missing. Brother Thomas, a monk from northern Italy, escaped during Lent and returned 3 days later, soaked in rain and looking sheepish. When asked why he came back, he said, "I thought I missed women. Turns out I just missed butter." The abbot punished him, of course, but quietly left a pat of butter on his plate the following week. Interestingly, some monks were sent away as punishment. If they caused too much trouble, flirted with novices, drank too much sacramental wine, composed questionable poetry, they were sometimes relocated to harsher abbeys. These transfer stations were nicknamed purgatories, cold, strict, and utterly joyless. A place to reflect and repent. One transfer order survives that simply reads, "Brother N to be reassigned," for excess enthusiasm. Yet even in the stories of those who left, there's a kind of poetry. They remind us that monks weren't spiritual machines. They wrestled with duty and freedom like anyone. Some stayed their whole lives. Others needed to know what waited beyond the walls, what their lives might have been if not wrapped in wool and silence. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we still remember their footsteps. Because while the cloister echoed with prayers, the world outside hummed with wind, chance, and temptation. And sometimes, a monk just had to follow that sound just once. The wool was scratchy. It itched in places you didn't know skin could itch. But for a medieval monk, wool was life literally. From head to toe, their garments were woven thick and heavy, meant to keep out cold, pests, and as the rule demanded, vanity. Yet beneath that coarse fabric, men discovered that even the simplest robes could become instruments of discomfort, and occasionally, tiny sources of delight. Start with the underwear or subligaculum, if you wanted to sound fancy in Latin. Most monks wore a simple tunic over loose breeches, but on particularly frigid mornings, some slipped on an extra layer, woolen drawers stitched by their own hands. This was technically allowed for health reasons, but health, of course, was a flexible concept. Brother Everard, for instance, swore his drawers were medically necessary. After a draft nearly froze his well. Let's just say his morale in the cloister garden. The abbot didn't argue. He'd never been one for details below the belt. Then there was the habit itself. A sleeveless tunic, cinched with a rope belt, covered by a flowing scapular and a hooded cowl. It looked simple enough until you realized monks wore it almost 24/7. Sleeping? Habit on. Bathing? Habit on. Praying? Habit on. Even in secret late-night feasts, a monk might tuck his tunic aside, but keep the rest intact, lest the abbot pass unexpectedly and spot an ankle scandalous. And so began the era of habit hacks. A monk might wear a thin linen shirt beneath the tunic to reduce chafing. Another would stuff bits of cloth at the shoulders to soften the rope belt's bite. Some even sewn little patches of sheep's wool, yes, ironic, inside the collar with a cowl rubbed the neck raw. They called it monastic padding, though you'd never admit it in front of novices. Hair, too, played its part. The tonsure, the iconic shaved crown with a fringe of hair, was a symbol of humility. But cold medieval winters didn't care about symbolism. That bare patch atop the head felt like a drafty rooftop chimney. Monks tried clever fixes. Some wore knitted wool skullcaps under their hoods, hidden cunningly, so no one questioned why the abbot's chapel remained 5 degrees warmer. Others lined their cowls with extra wool scraps, creating a secret double layer that felt like a perpetual hug around the scalp. Need I mention socks? Or more accurately, the lack thereof. Leather sandals were standard footwear, even in winter, with only a thin woolen layer often sold separately at the abbey marketplace. Many monks raided the infirmary for extra foot wraps, long strips of cloth that could be wrapped and tied, saving toes from frostbite. Brother Otto reportedly wrapped his feet so tightly he could only shuffle. He called it focused meditation. His fellow monks called it ankle imprisonment. All of these adjustments came with their own quirks. Patches wore thin at unexpected places, like our old friend Brother Eamon, who once knitted extra padding at his hip to prevent the rope belt's bite, only to tear a hole in his tunic mid-procession and reveal, heaven forbid, a patch that looked like a large, woolly octopus. He maintained it represented the tentacular embrace of divine mercy. The abbot accepted that explanation, but sent him to mend his robes for the 5th time. Despite the itch, monks loved their habits. They felt uniform unity, a palpable reminder that they were part of something bigger than themselves. But unity didn't preclude personal flair. A few monks embroidered small crosses or astrological symbols inside the hem's secret signals to like-minded brothers. Brother Gregory, obsessed with rainbows, stitched 7 tiny colored threads just above his left pocket. No one noticed until he bent over during Vespers, and the light hit it just right. He was politely rebuked for worldly decoration, but quietly admitted he felt a bit more cheerful. Perhaps the funniest wardrobe tale involves Brother Anselm's attempt at monastic fashion. Inspired by a merchant's tapestry depicting a nobleman's fur-lined cloak, he bribed a stable boy for a handful of horsehair furs. Medicinal scrubbing implements, he called them. He wove the fur into the collar of his cowl. For one glorious evening, he felt like a wandering saint turned fur-trimmed trendsetter. The next morning, his collar had matted into a stiff, itchy bristle that rattled like a porcupine whenever he nodded in prayer. He dismantled it with tears, half sweat, half laughter. Beyond clothing, personal cleanliness was a chore. Water was precious, and bathing a luxury. Monks often went weeks without a proper wash, navigating the delicate balance between health and chastity. But cold, stiff habits magnified every itch, every stench, every patch of sweat. A brother might slip away during Compline to wash his feet in a hidden basin, humming softly to mask the sound. Others carried sachets of dried lavender or mint, tucking them into underwear as aromatic therapy. The abbot later banned unsanctioned fragrances, so monks had to crush herbs under their sun-cooked tunics instead. Of course, not all gaps in attire were for comfort. Some were statements. A handful of monks intentionally wore habits so threadbare that their own rope belts threatened to fall off. It was a humble protest against opulence, or perhaps a plea for new laundry duty. Either way, these ragged robes earned sneaking pity from the novices, who slipped them extra bread during meals. But for every itchy patch and clandestine padding, there were stories of resilience. Monks believed that enduring discomfort brought them closer to Christ's own sacrifices. So when the habit chafed, they prayed through it. When the cowl pinched, they whispered a song. And when winter winds howled through the tonsure, they reminded themselves that even the cold served a holy purpose. In the end, the wool undergarments, the shaved heads, the rope belts, all the trappings of monastic life became tests of will. They separated the merely curious from the deeply committed. Yet within those trials, monks found moments of ingenuity, laughter, and unexpected camaraderie. A brother might spot another, adjusting his leg padding in the chapel pew, and catch his eye just a brief look that said, "I know. Me too." A silent bond stronger than any ornate embroidery. So next time you slip into your softest pajamas, spare a thought for those medieval monks and their itchy wool men who found warmth not in comfort, but in community, craft, and the shared knowledge that sometimes the path to devotion is a bit scratchy. The monastery settles into a hush after Compline, but silence in stone corridors is never complete. A single candle's flame throws waltzing shadows on ribbed vaults, and every creak, whether a settling beam or a tiptoe novice, is magnified in the night. For medieval monks, these hours held both reverence and a tingle of unease, as superstition and ritual intertwined beneath the faint glow of tallow lamps. To begin, imagine Brother Cuthbert, whose wool-lined subligulum from last week still itched in protest recall that scratchy padding we met in Section 8. Tonight, he drags a stool to the refectory's side alcove, sets down a half-melted candle, and offers a soft prayer to St. Anthony, patron of lost things. Not because he's lost anything, well, aside from a prized wooden snail from Brother Martin's tournament, but because Anthony is good for guarding souls against wandering spirits. Cuthbert's voice is barely a whisper, struggling not to sneeze when the candle snuffs itself in a puff of smoke. "Thanks for nothing," he mutters, tapping the wick. Was it a draught or something else? You see, candles were more than light, they were ritual. Monks believed the flame linked this world to the next. Candlelit vigils at midnight invited guardian spirits. Snuffed flames could signal disapproval or a restless soul. Sometimes an attentive brother would relight a dying taper 3 times, once for his own safety, once for the community, and once for the departed. If the wick refused to catch, he'd whisper into the darkness, "Go on then, cross over," hoping to coax any lingering specter along. Inevitably, another monk would be waiting to swipe the flame for his secret snack, because even ghosts can't resist a bit of dinner theft. Footsteps in the corridor sound measured, but solitary echoes can suggest another presence. In many abbeys, the novices circulated through the cloisters at night, checking that doors were locked and lamps filled. They recited brief prayers, Exi Nunc or Sanct Dies, pausing at each archway. Yet, every so often, a soft sobbing or a distant murmur clung to the stones. Was it a novice practicing chant, or something older? The monks joked that the building itself wept for centuries of dusty scrolls and midnight cheese raids. Stories of ghostly monks abounded. One common tale told of Brother Peter, who, 300 years earlier, had fallen asleep in the chapter house and never woken. His spirit supposedly lingered, patrolling the seats where he once sat. Any monk unlucky enough to stand in the wrong spot at Vespers reported a chill on his neck, followed by a whisper, "Silence, please." The abbey chapter walls bore scrawled warnings. Do not sit in Peter's bench. Many did anyway, and then blamed the squirrel Felix, remember him, for stealing their upper cloak when they jumped up. Some nights, when wind rattled small windows, the choir stalls would groan like an old horse. Monks attributed it to shifting wood, but novices spoke in hushed tones of a chain-rattling spirit condemned for poor penance. Legend held that this soul roamed after the church bells tolled Compline, dragging spectral shackles that echoed down the hall. If you paused by the northwest corridor, they said, you'd glimpse a faint light bobbing, like a lantern carried by unseen hands. Monks learned to avoid that route, especially if they'd missed dessert. And dessert was no small matter. Imagine the temptation. A secret sausage dangling from the bell rope, a hidden jar of honey behind the pantry door. In the dead of night, some brothers risked the haunting simply to fetch a forbidden's taste. They'd creep through the kitchen's little hell, praying their footsteps wouldn't summon wailing voices. One monk confessed he heard bells chiming the hour despite the absence of a bell ringer, until he realized it was the crackling of sausages in the oven, his mind's plea for a midnight snack. Superstition extended to dreams, too. If a brother dreamed of water dripping on his head, it meant a future flood or a forthcoming visit from the cellar master demanding more wine. Dreaming of birdsong could signify angelic visitation, but dreaming of owls? That was a bad omen. Warning of sickness or a falling beam. Many monks kept small prayer books open by their pillows, hoping the sight of scripture would ward off nightmares. Others stuffed tiny crosses under their mattresses, though, if you recalled Brother Elias's eccentric weather notes in Section 3, you'd know the cross often shifted position by morning, leading to interpretive debates about spiritual wind. Candles aside, nighttime rituals involved confession. Once a week, brothers rose at the holy hour, wrapped in habits, and tiptoed to the confessional stalls. There, in hushed tones, they listed sins, glancing at the cheese, forgetting a verse, doodling rabbits in a bishop's hat. The confessor, behind a screen, responded softly with penance's 100 Our Fathers, or abstaining from honey for 2 Sundays. If the penitent shivered, the confessor might press a finger through the grill for reassurance, a small, tactile link between sin and absolution. They claimed it was a holy touch. We know it was partly to prevent the confession from sounding like a grocery list. Night vigils varied by season. In winter, when the abbey's stones felt frost in the marrow, monks gathered in the cloister for spellium, a vigil of hymns and laments. They'd move slowly from candle to candle, snuffing each in turn, representing humanity moving from darkness to divine light. Occasionally, a brother would slip and snort mid-chant a high note in an otherwise somber melody, earning a stifled giggle that echoed like a chime. The leader would raise an eyebrow, and the room hush would snap back, as though gravity itself chastised the laughter. In autumn, some abbeys held a ghost mass on All Hallows' Eve. Monks wore black cowls, lights were dimmed, and readings focused on martyrdom and judgment. They processed in single file, torches flickering like wilting flowers. One English monastery specialized in a dramatic reading of the Book of the Dead, complete with rattles, and whispered, "Memento mori." Novices fainted. Seasoned monks rolled their eyes, but couldn't hide the smile as they lowered voices for the creed. Candles, ghosts, and rituals shaped each night, but so did companionship. If the cold bit too sharply, brothers huddled together, sharing blankets and tailies. One would recount the cheese incident of St. Hildreth's Day, and soon the group was howling with laughter. The sound filled the vaulted spaces, warding off any phantom that fancied itself a poor stand-up comedian. Yet even the bravest felt a tremor when the moon cast strange patterns through rose windows, or when an owl's cry split the air. At times, long-dead abbots seemed to reach across centuries, reminding monks that life in the cloister was both sacred and fragile. Every creak, every flicker, every soft footfall carried meaning. Sometimes it was innocent, sometimes it wasn't. And so, wrapped in itchy habits and scratchy padding, monks learned to walk the line between devotion and dread. They tended candles like precious souls, read lips in darkness, and listened for the faintest hint of a whisper that wasn't their own. In those hours, between prayer and dawn, they felt closest to both heaven and the unknown. In the morning, the abbey would wake with chanting, bells, and the promise of fresh porridge. But for those who stood vigil, those silent sentinels who braved rattling chains and phantom sighs, the real test was whether they emerged with faith intact, or whether some piece of them stayed behind, lingering in the echo of a candle's last gasp. Pilgrims on dusty roads, peddlers with creaking carts, and the soft rustle of rolled-up parchments when they arrived at the abbey gate. They carried more than food and trinkets. They brought whispers of the world beyond, hidden letters, and the promise of news too spicy for cloistered ears. The monastery, for all its stone walls and strict routines, buzzed quietly with smuggled gossip and clandestine commerce. Picture Brother Elric perched on a wooden bench by the gatehouse. He shifts in his scratchy habit. Remember the wool padding from Section 8? And gives each newcomer a polite nod. He inspects baskets of dried figs and clay jars of oil. But he's really watching for the pale face of a pilgrim, clutching a secret note pressed between folds of cloak. Word would trickle through the order. The king's mistress has a new lover. Or a fierce storm wrecked 3 merchant ships off the coast. News that would set ink-stained hearts racing faster than any fear of the abbot. Many pilgrims came to venerate relics, pieces of saints' bones, shreds of martyrs' garments, or splintered wood from a holy cross. They'd kneel before the reliquary, eyes closed, murmuring prayers, but afterward they'd linger for ale and gossip. Monks leaned close, offering extra cups in exchange for juicy details from Rome or rumor of crusader exploits. In one French abbey, an itinerant preacher confessed afterward that he'd sold more postcards of the relics than delivered sermons thankfully. The abbot never heard about that little sideline. Peddlers, meanwhile, were the traveling supermarkets of the medieval world. They carried everything from iron nails to true crystal rosary beads, from honeycomb to tinted glass for windows. At the monastery gate, they shouted their wares, a cheerful clatter under the bell tower. But tucked among their barrels of salted cod or spindle wheels were messages, tiny scrolls hidden inside hollowed gourds or strapped beneath leather belts. A monk might slip away under pretext of fetching water to intercept the peddler, deftly extract a message, and share the news at midnight in the dormitory. Of course, not every visitor was a genuine pilgrim or honest dealer. Some were spies in coarse cloaks, seeking to learn the abbey's secrets, its holdings of silver, its network of letter copiers, or even the location of that secret pantry we met in Section 5. One such rogue, calling himself Brother Simon, arrived claiming to be from a distant order. He took standard vows, joined prayers, and charmed the novices. Only after weeks did the infirmarian notice his scalloped insignia of a rival abbey hidden beneath his tunic. He was asked to leave politely and swiftly. Gossip, you see, traveled faster than a monk's quill. A pilgrim's news could reach an abbey before the abbot's official letters. In one remarkable case, monks in England heard of a papal decree before their own bishop did, because a visiting friar had smuggled the bull in a wine bottle. It arrived with a cork pierced by a tiny rolled parchment. No one protested the sacrilege. This was news worth uncorking. The abbey library's front door, then locked for 2 days while they debated how to catalog it. The exchange of news wasn't always benign. Sometimes it was scandalous. A convent 2 cloisters over might send pleas for help. Our prioress behaves oddly, convoking midnight dances behind the chapel. The letter, doubled up and sealed with wax, made its way into the monks' hands. Though they had no jurisdiction, curiosity spurred them to code a response. Bring more wine, and we'll join you. Thankfully, the convent's next courier was stopped by a mischievous dog, so neither side ever saw the reply. Snacks, too, were invaluable currency. Pilgrim might offer candied, ginger exotic, and rare as thanks for a warm bed. In return, monks slipped him cured ham or extra cheese, in spite of the abbot's fasting decrees. One guest insisted he was carrying provisions for the poor, yet the poor chap had a hearty waistline by the end of his stay. The novice deacon discovered the stash behind the choir stalls and ate his fill before dawn. He blamed urgent scholarly research when caught napping in the refectory. Letters moved by brazen methods. Brother Luke was known for hollowing out the bread loaves delivered by peddlers. He'd stuff tiny billets written in minuscule script, then reseal the loaf. To the untrained eye, it was just a modest chunk of barley bread. To the recipient, it was the latest court intrigue about a countess's suspiciously frequent pilgrimages. Such letters often began with "my dearest confessor," though they were meant for secular ears. The abbot caught wind of the trick only when one loaf burst open, scattering notes across the chapter house floor like confetti. Sometimes, the monks themselves became the messengers. A brother with a particularly nimble sleeve might volunteer as porter at the gate. He'd help load pilgrims' packs, then slip into the road behind, arriving days later with first-hand news. On one occasion, Brother Odo set out demanding penance for sneaking into a nearby port city. He returned with exotic textiles and a tale of shipwrecked pilgrims turned pirates. The abbot's response? A modest penance cleaning the stables for a fortnight plus a slightly enlarged allowance of lentil stew to nurse his bruised dignity. In a few rare moments, news from the world profoundly shaped monastic life. A peasant uprising in a distant county led to a sudden influx of worried pilgrims seeking sanctuary. The abbey gates swung open as frightened families poured in, clutching talismans and terrified toddlers. Monks had to scramble, setting aside texts and turning scriptorum desks into cradles. They shared bread, wine, and prayers until the unrest subsided. It taught them that while their days were measured in psalms and seasons, the world's storms could batter even the sturdiest cloister walls. Not all rumor was false. One pilgrim brought word of a scholar in Toledo who had translated a rare Arabic manuscript on medicine. The abbot dispatched 2 cautious brothers under cover of night to fetch copies. They returned with not only medical insights, but also a small vial of rosewater said to heal headaches. The infirmarian declared it a miracle. The abbot declared it fundraising fodder. Soon, neighboring abbeys sent donations for a vial of Toledo's blessed essence. Through it all, the monks maintained discretion. No need to shout in the refectory that the empress's jewels might be smuggled in silk lining. A quiet knock at the scriptorium door, a nod, and the murmured council began. In the cloister's hush, news had power. It could shift alliances, save reputations, or simply entertain minds desperate for distraction from the daily grind. Yet for all the clandestine thrill, monks reminded themselves they were servants of God, not courtiers or spies. Gossip might tingle the ear, but it risked envy, discord, and broken vows. So they invented codes, euphemisms for scandal, metaphors for conflict, even scrambled Latin to discuss delicate matters. Only the most trusted brothers could decipher the hidden meanings. If a note read, "The lily wilts at dawn," it meant trust no one before sunrise. It was playful, profound, and utterly necessary. When pilgrims, peddlers, and smuggled letters finally departed the abbey gates, the monks climbed back into their routines, parchment and quill awaiting them. But the stories they carried lingered like spilled and scent-sweet, heady, impossible to ignore. In that interplay between stone walls and open roads, a monastery stayed connected to the wider world, guided by the rhythm of prayer, yet pulsing with the heartbeat of news and human curiosity. So the next time you feel a text ping on your phone in the dead of night, imagine a monk clutching a candlelit scroll, eager for the next piece of gossip from afar. Some things never change. Deep in the hush of the monastic library, rows of silent shelves held treasures more precious than gold. Fragile manuscripts, illuminated gospels, and stacks of parchment that bore the weight of centuries. But no library, no matter how holy, was immune to temptation. For some monks, these collections weren't just repositories of faith. They were opportunities for mischief, ambition, and even outright theft. Tonight, we slip behind the velvet curtains of monastic scholarship to unspool the curious tale of the great library heist. Imagine Brother Simeon, a quiet scholar with gentle eyes and ink-stained fingers. During the day, he copied scripture with meticulous care, whispering prayers with each stroke of his quill. But when the librarian's back was turned, Simeon's eyes darted to the rarest volumes. A 10th century bestiary with startlingly vivid woodcuts, a sheepskin codex rumored to contain a long-lost prophecy, and a slim folio of secular poetry that made him gasp at the audacity of its verses. He coveted those books like a layman craving jewels. The monastery's library wasn't a fortress. It was a sanctuary built on mutual trust. Rare volumes were chained to lecterns, an almost romantic solution. The book free to read, the reader bound to its place. But chains could be slipped, lecterns moved, and keys borrowed. And in a world without catalog numbers and inventory software, a missing book might not be noticed for months, stored as lost in scriptorum. One biting winter night, Simeon enacted his plan. He climbed the spiral staircase that led to the locked cabinet, an ornate oak enclosure said to have been carved by a master artisan. With borrowed keys lifted from the abbot's study and a hidden lockpick of his own making, he opened the cabinet door. Inside lay the prized 15th century travelogue of an Egyptian monk, a text both exotic and exceedingly valuable. He lifted it, cradling its cover as though it were a bird's egg, and slipped it under his tunic. Exiting the library, he passed Brother Humphrey on sentry duty. Humphrey nodded absent-mindedly. Winter meant long nights and fewer patrols. Simeon reached his cell, bolted the door, and unwrapped the codex. The love of the forbiddens warmed him more than the crackling hearth. He stayed up until dawn, tracing Arabic script with trembling fingertips, imagining the deserts and miracles described within. But secrets, like shadows, have a way of revealing themselves. A novice who sought a borrowed psalter found the cabinet lock swollen for moisture, its key refusing to turn. The librarian noticed a faint scrape on the oak frame, virtually invisible, but enough to whisper suspicion. A search followed. Books were counted, lecterns inspected. One morning, the abbot announced a series of small penances for the community, extra vesper prayers, and extended library hours. Everyone knew everyone suspected. Simeon did not confess. He feigned innocence, eyes downcast, voice gentle. But guilt weighed as heavily as any chain. Weeks passed before he could bear the silence that thudded between pages. On a moonless night, he retrieved the codex from under a floorboard, that secret shelf carved by a bored novice decades earlier, and returned it to its cabinet, keys jingling like contrition. The abbot never spoke Simeon's name. No public confession. No chains. Instead, he granted Simeon a new duty, cataloging and cleaning every chained book in the library. Simeon spent months in the chapel-like quiet, running his hands over iron fixtures, ensuring locks turned smoothly, and polishing lecterns until they gleamed. He called it his penance. At dawn, he whispered a prayer of thanks for mercy, for duty, and for the chance to serve the very books he nearly lost. Simeon's story was the most dramatic, but not the only one. Elsewhere in the abbey, Brother Patrick, enthralled by an illuminated psalter, desecrated a page to extract a brilliant patch of gold leaf. He used it to patch holes in the chapel's candle bowls. It worked until candle wax melted the leaf, and a gilded drip betrayed his theft. His penance was to clean every candle bowl for a year, wiping off golden residue until he admitted how he came by it. Some monks took more bureaucratic routes. A clever scribe named Brother Hugh realized that if he swapped the title pages of two books one valuable, one ordinary no one would notice until a patron from Rome requested the genuine item. He used the delay to copy the rare text and sell transcriptions. His scheme unraveled when a visiting scholar, fluent in Syriac, questioned the provenance of a Syrian gospel. Hugh was exiled to a stricter abbey, where he spent weeks copying only approved liturgical texts. Of course, not all heists were for profit or consumption. Some were acts of protest. Brother Francis, outraged by what he saw as censorship, smuggled out passages from controversial works banned by the abbot. He passed them to sympathetic friars who printed them in secret. He believed that truth, whether theological or scientific, must not be shrouded by chains. When discovered, he faced trial but remained unbroken. His courageous smuggling ignited quiet debates about intellectual freedom in monastic circles. And let's not forget the librarians themselves. Temptation was always near. One custodian, tasked with restoring a damaged manuscript, saw an opportunity, the chance to correct what he deemed theological errors in a local saint's life. He altered passages to elevate the saint's heroics. When the abbot compared the manuscript to the original copy in Rome, the discrepancy emerged. The librarian spent months rewriting his falsified miracles, all under cold candlelight. These library escapades remind us that medieval monks held books with both reverence and envy. They protected knowledge as divine trust, yet human curiosity and ambition continually tested that trust. Chains and locks stood guard, but they could not bind desire. And desire, whether for wealth, justice, or simple wonder, drove monks to ill-advised adventures among the stacks. In the end, the great library heist was less about theft and more about relationship, how men and books interact, how sacred texts can inspire devotion, rebellion, or even temptation. The monastic library was a crossroads of faith and knowledge, discipline and desire. And in its silent aisles, the greatest heist was sometimes the theft of certainty itself. The moment a monk dared to believe he could possess, control, or reshape divine wisdom. As dawn broke and the choir sang, the library doors opened once more, heavy with promise. The books rested on their chains, faithful as ever. And somewhere, a monk guilt-eased or ambition-tempered picked one up and began to read, finding in its pages solace, challenge, and the unending call of curiosity. The warm, yeasty aroma drifted through the stone arches like a blessing until it didn't. Monastic breweries were places of reverence almost as solemn as the chapel itself. After all, beer wasn't just a drink. It was liquid bread, daily sustenance, and sometimes a covert pleasure. From the humblest ale to rich, dark bocks, monks perfected the art of brewing with patience, precision, and just enough secrecy to keep the abbot on his toes. Early each morning, long before the dawn bells summoned matins, the brewmaster slipped into the brewery's low-lit vault. Imagine him robe sleeves rolled up, rope belt tucked safely away, staring at wooden vats that smelled of barley, hops, and warm dreams. He measured grains by weight, timing mash temperatures to the minute. Think back to Section 5, where Brother Thaddeus coaxed lentil stew into sinfully rich feasts. In the brewery, similar artistry unfolded with malt and water. The process was intricate, steeping grains, boiling the wort, cooling through copper coils, and finally, watching as yeast monastery grown and beloved began its slow alchemy. Monks guarded their yeast strains as zealously as relics. The finest abbeys kept their mother yeast in sealed crocks, fed daily with fresh mash. Legend claimed the yeast of St. Gall had been propagated from a droplet of Christ's own blood, but every brewer agreed it produced an unsurpassed head of foam. Hops, too, were precious not just for bitterness, but for preserving the brew. Some monks grew their own in cloister gardens, training vines around trellises carved with tiny crosses. One Cistercian order even held weekly hop blessings, where the novice responsible recited a short liturgy over each plant, invoking protection against blight and against sneaky pilfers from other orders. After all, green hops could be swapped for oregano in a pinch. A batch without the real thing tasted like watered-down regret. When fermentation began, the brewery became a domain of whispered ritual. Senior monks circled vats in procession, each carrying a taper to symbolize the infusion of light into dark brew. They tapped the first barrel with a small hammer carved in the shape of a barley sheaf. A soft crack echoed, and the initial release of carbon dioxide was called the brewer's breath, marking the beer as ready for tasting, though only a few monks were permitted the sacred draught. That tasting, mind you, was serious business. A single sip could determine the fates of entire crops. If the brew was too sour, malt ratios were adjusted. If too flat, yeast was revived with a pinch of honey. Monks took tasting notes with the same solemnity they wrote illuminating manuscripts. One brewer famously annotated his records with emotive phrases like melancholy brown or joyous effervescence, sparking envy and gentle ribbing from colleagues. But perfection bred temptation. Even the most disciplined brother found 2 mugs could become 4 or 8. Remember Brother Marcus from Section 5, who whispered to his stewpot. A similar brother might have whispered to his fermenting ale, and then wandered off in a merry haze to borrow extra cheeses for pairing. Late-night gatherings in a brewery were hush affairs. A circle of mugs, low laughter, and the occasional snore as someone toppled into a grain sack. The abbot, of course, frowned upon overindulgence. He issued strict guidelines. Never more than a holy cup each meal, no brewing on penitential days, and certainly no carrying kegs through the cloister at 2 a.m. yet loopholes abounded. If you brewed on a feast of an obscure local saint, say, Saint Eupraxia of the Moth, you could claim divine dispensation. After all, the rule permitted wine in moderation on feast days. The abbot might grumble, but who dared question the will of Saint Eupraxia, especially when the beer was that good? Secret recipes also traveled in hushed voices. One monk, Brother Ardal, carried a tattered parchment listing the 12 ancient steps of brewing, handed down from his mentor. It included unorthodox additions: a sprig of rosemary at the boil, a handful of dried berries at the final racking, even a dash of rosewater for celestial perfume. The result was a beer both aromatic and sweet, so sweet that novices sometimes mistook it for mead. Ardal's batch became legendary, served only to visiting abbots and the very best brewers. Over time, some breweries amassed near-mythical reputations. Travelers would detour miles to taste liquid prayer from a particular cloister. Inns displayed the abbey's seal on their doors, advertising the rare treat within. Money from beer sales funded parchments, repairs, and ironically, more brewing equipment. One abbey built an entire new wing complete, with its own brewery solely on ale profits. Monks joked that if Jesus turned water into wine, they were doing next-level miracles with water into beer. Yet for all the reverence, accidents happened. Boilers overheated, boiling over into steaming floods of sticky wort that glued doors shut. Fermentation went wild, bursting barrels like miniature volcanoes. One particularly enthusiastic batch fermented so vigorously, it exploded through the hatch, coating the ceiling in a foam that took weeks to scrape away. The monk in charge was reassigned to the latrines, a fitting penance, he joked, since he'd effectively baptized them in ale. And then there were the beards. Warm vapors, splashes of foam, and dripping kegs turned many monks into walking brewmaster billboards. Beards caught in wooden taps, foam dried into tiny white beards, and once legend has it, a brewer's beard cultivated its own yeast colony. Other monks teased that he was growing a second beard of fermented barley. He simply nodded and said, "Every beard tells a story." Despite the chaos, brewing remained an act of devotion. Monks believed that nourishing the body with wholesome ale served God's will. They dedicated their work to saints of agriculture and hospitality, offering the first fruits of each batch at the high altar. And when pilgrims raised a mug in gratitude, it was more than beer. It was fellowship, charity, and faith flowing in a cup. So next time you savor a hearty ale, imagine the centuries of care, invention, and yes, merry accidents that shaped it. From secret yeast crocks to midnight toasts, monastic brewers blended science, art, and spirit in each foaming mug. And though the rule of Saint Benedict may not have foreseen barley sheaves at the altar, it certainly gained generations of monks whose holy work sometimes ended with a satisfied belch and a prayer of thanks. Cats, chickens, bees, and donkeys. Oh my! Monastic life wasn't just about silent prayer and ink-stained fingers. It was also about unexpected companionship. Animals roamed the cloister like unofficial residents, serving practical needs, boosting morale, and occasionally causing holy mischief. In this section, we meet the feathered, furred, and sometimes scaly friends who found sanctuary in abbeys and sometimes turned the quiet days upside down. First, cats. Every medieval abbey kept cats to control the rodent population in granaries and libraries. Yet, as you might have guessed from Section 2's cheese incident, cheese and parchment attracted more than just mice. Brother Erasmus's library cat, Simon, learned to paw open chained manuscripts and sharpened his claws on leather bindings. Monks tolerated Simon's antics because he was a gifted mouser and purred like a tiny engine during evening chants. One story tells of a cat who refused to leave the altar steps until a particular hymn ended, as if he too were in worship. Chickens, in contrast, provided breakfast. They strutted through the courtyard, head-dressed novices offering grain morning and evening. Yet these hens had personalities like Hilda, the hen who laid emerald green eggs so prized that monks reserved them for high holy days. Legend says Hilda once roosted atop the abbot's lectern during a sermon, her gentle clucks prompting a rare smile from his grace and an awkward pause in the homily. Bees, however, were sacred workers. Monks cultivated hives for wax used in candles and honey, a precious sweetener. Bee lore permeated monastic teaching. They saw bees as paragons of community, selfless workers who served a queen. In some abbeys, novices learned reading by tracing chalk outlines of bees on slate, each stroke reinforcing humility and unity. When a hive swarmed or vanished, monastic records treated it like a tragedy. One Cistercian chronicle mourned, "The bees departed. The brothers' hearts followed." Not all creatures were so tame. Donkeys, used for haulage and pilgrim transport, often acted stubborn. Brother Leonard, assigned to the stable, swore his donkey, Benjamin, recognized phrases like "water the garden" or "go to market." Yet Benjamin never failed to freeze mid-stride, braying disapproval until coaxed with apples. Leonard's day became a negotiation, learning patience and the fine art of donkey diplomacy. Then there were the unconventional. One abbey kept swans on its fish pond, both for meat and spectacle. The swans glided like silent sentinels, and monks believed they guarded the water from demons. They even trained one swan, Ursula, to carry messages in a small basket, tied to her leg, though only between 2 steps of the lily pond, and only if she felt industrious. Frogs, too, found their way into monastic lore. Gardens around abbeys were wet enough to attract them, and monks wrote poems about their croaking choruses, comparing them to cheeky choir boys during a particularly raucous service. One monk crafted a tiny frog puppet to sit on the pulpit, used only on April Fools, another example of sanctioned silliness in a serious world. We can't forget the barn cat's opposite, barn owls. These silent predators nested in belfry beams, hunting mice and offering an eerie serenade at dusk. Monks left small bowls of cream in hidden corners to coax owls nearer, believing their watchful eyes warded off evil spirits. On nights when the owl's call was too loud, however, some brothers claimed they felt the wings brush their faces as they slept, an unsettling reminder of nature's thin veil between blessing and bit of terror. Occasionally, monks adopted more exotic pets, though records are scant because few survived travel. One wandering noble gifted a pair of peacocks to a Yorkshire priory, captivated by their shimmering tail feathers. The monks, initially horrified, eventually learned to feed them grain, and the peacocks became local celebrities, their call echoing through cloisters at dawn. When peacocks molted their glorious plumage, monks ritually repurposed the quills for deluxe quills, each feather a testament to the extraordinary in the ordinary. Monastic medicine also drew animal assistance. Leeches were kept for bloodletting, frogs for testing poultices, and dogs for guiding blind brothers. One senior monk, afflicted by poor vision, was assigned a gentle hound named Lux, which led him from cell to chapel. Lux's loyalty inspired a small chapel painting depicting Christ as a shepherd dog, a forbidden image. Though it quietly hung for decades, before a visiting bishop remarked on the curious canine halo. And then, of course, there were the unofficial mascots, mice, tiny, scuttling guests in cloister kitchens. They provided entertainment chasing after spilled kernels, and a reminder that no pantry was ever truly secure. Some monks trapped mice humanely and released them in the fields, only for them to return days later, proof that hospitality knew no bounds. To these animal friendships, monks found solace and connection. A cat's purr after a long vigil, a chicken's soft cluck heralding dawn, the comforting buzz of bees, a donkey's steadfast bray, a peacock's showy display. These creatures wove themselves into daily life practical companions, spiritual symbols, and sometimes just a much-needed distraction. In a world structured by prayer, these animals reminded monks of creation's breath, that God's work wasn't confined to stone walls or parchment pages. It fluttered, grazed, and flapped through the cloister, often uninvited, bringing humor, wonder, and a touch of chaos. And when a monk scratched behind a cat's ear, tickled a donkey's ear, or tasted a drop of honey fresh from the comb, he tasted, in a small way, the divine tapestry of life itself, an ever-present reminder that holiness can come wrapped in fur, feathers, or wings. The abbey's bells tolled with uncommon urgency. The bishop himself was approaching. Word traveled through stone corridors like wildfire. Within moments, the cloister's lively undercurrents, half-eaten cheese tucked beneath benches, illicit notes hidden in hymnals, and the faint aroma of secret ale had to vanish. The monks sprang into motion, a silent army of corners to sweep, tables to polish, and feasts to conceal. Behind each door, a hush of frantic activity masked by the usual drone of prayers. Brother Remy, in charge of the refectory, seized every stray loaf and jar. Where 2 days' worth of honey-glazed dates had rested, only empty platters now remained. Novices darted about, stacking chairs and removing any trace of untidy pew cushions. "Remember," hissed the cellarer, "the bishop appreciates austerity." Yet one monk couldn't resist a final glance at the hidden shelf behind the wine rack, just long enough to pocket a single plump grape before whisking it away. In the scriptorium, vellum scraps littered the floor from undone doodles and half-finished secret messages. Brother Paul, the dollhouse furniture maker, frantically hid his miniature abbot's chair beneath a stack of blank parchment. He nearly dropped it when he heard the heavy thud of the bishop's litter against the outer gate. A chorus of muffled coughs and whispered, "Bless me, Father," rippled through the room as pens were stowed and lids snapped shut. Personal grooming reached its peak. Monks scraped their tonsures free of lint, dusted hood linings until they gleamed, and attempted to mend unraveled hem stitches with trembling fingers. One particularly nervous brother attempted to trim his own beard with a sharpened quill, resulting in a jagged hedge just below his chin. He hid it beneath his cowl, regretting both the haircut and the improvised cowl tuck. The infirmary team worked overtime, dressing invisible wounds, last night's cough, a suspicious bruise from overzealous mending, and the telltale sweat stains of midnight overindulgence. "You look much healthier now," said the infirmarian cheerfully, patting a brother's forehead to induce a flash of shine under the cowl. A quick brush of chalk across a dusty robe erased the faintest hint of spilled ink from a clandestine love letter. Then came the rehearsals. The monks lined up in the nave, practicing their responses. The Latin intonation had to be flawless. Dominus vobiscum, delivered with measured warmth. Genuflections so precise that no knee creaked. One brother stumbled at "Et cum spiritu tu," and muttered something under his breath. The novice next to him stifled a laugh. They tried again. This time, a collective nod and chorus echoed beneath the high vaults in near-perfect harmony. The choir stall occupants polished their hymnals until the gold leaf letters sparkled. Manuscript illuminations, once casually thumbed for secret messages, were turned face down or hidden altogether. Whatever shall we do with these blank pages? A brother whispered. No one knew yet. The abbot himself moved through the ranks, inspecting silently, as though each monk's calm composure weighed upon his soul. Meanwhile, the novices rehearsed footwork for procession. Each step measured, each turn choreographed. A misstep could mean a scolding or worse, a curt shaking of the shoulder from the visiting dignitary. The novices practiced the precise moment to lift their heads, so that their front row choir stalls would present an image of serene devotion. A sudden sneeze echoed through the nave, drawing scandalized glances, but also an irrepressible grin from Brother Aldwin, who'd once tried to smuggle a pet squirrel into matins. Out in the courtyard, lay brothers scrubbed the stone floor until their fingertips bled, and the gray slabs shone like polished pewter. They swept away stray autumn leaves and stacked wooden buckets by the well. Despite the rigors, there was a spark of camaraderie, shared grunts, quick nods of solidarity, and a single whispered joke about the bishop's notorious fondness for sweetmeats. Within the hidden kitchen, little hell, brother, Thaddeus worked feverishly to transform yesterday's stew into something worthy of episcopal taste. He diced vegetables with surgical precision, stirred sauces until they glowed with gentle richness, and plated each offering on pewter dishes with careful artistry. He whispered a prayer over each spoonful, hoping to avert discovery and earn a nod of approval. At the abbot's private quarters, secret documents, lists of hidden pantries, coded correspondence, and letters from nearby convents were tucked into locked chests or burned in small heaps. The abbot himself reviewed what remained on his desk: an official letter from the crown, a modest purse of silver from a grateful noble, and a plain wooden box containing his personal rosary. When his steward stepped in with the last tidbit, a hand-copied tract on penance, he laid it aside and closed the desk with a resolute snap. And then, through the heavy doors, the bishop entered, cloaked in crimson robes, flanked by attendants bearing incense burners and parchment scrolls. He moved with deliberate grace. His keen eyes swept the assembled monks, each habit sharp, each gaze steady. For a moment, the abbey felt suspended in time, every breath held, every foot poised to press the stone. In that moment of perfect stillness, the years of secret mischief, hidden feasts, and whispered romances seemed a distant echo. The monks bowed as one, voices rising in sacred greeting. They had concealed their flaws, polished their devotion, and rehearsed their piety. Yet beneath the composed facades, they carried their secret lives, hidden like storms beneath calm seas. As the bishop blessed the abbey and offered words of guidance, the monks listened with earnest faces. But in cloisters, the memory of panic cleaning, rehearsed prayers, and carefully concealed comforts lingered long after the incense smoke had cleared. And when the final amen faded into the rafters, they would return quietly to their true routines, carrying forward both reverence and mischief in equal measure. The rafters above the chapel seemed to sigh as vespers began, voices rising in solemn harmony. Outside, dusk-painted stained glass windows with ruby and gold, and within, the brothers gathered, hooded and still, all except Brother Cadfael, who was never seen again after that fateful evening prayer. Cadfael was a quiet man, unremarkable in many ways, but in others, unforgettable. He'd arrived at the abbey in his 20s, having served as a traveling herbalist. His knowledge of plants had saved more than one brother from fever. His poultices were as famed as the brewery's ale. He kept bees in secret hives beyond the orchard, and he whistled to them in low, comforting tones. That evening, the abbot led the community in the Magnificat. Candles flickered like distant stars. As the choir intoned the final Gloria Patri, a distant wind rattled a loose shutter. When the final amen faded, the brothers rose in silence except Cadfael, who did not stand. Red-faced, Brother Gregory knelt beside him. Cadfael's hands lay limp in his lap. His eyes stared past the altar rail into shadows. Gregory hissed for help. In moments, novices and lay brothers swarmed the choir stalls, checking every seat, every corner. Cadfael was gone. Searches began immediately. The cloister paths were combed by torchlight. The orchard, with its hidden beehives, was scoured. The herb garden, where Cadfael spent hours, was raked barren. The surrounding woods were patrolled by lay brothers and local shepherds. No sign of a struggle. No footprints apart from those of searchers. Only the faint scent of crushed lavender, his favorite, and a single honeycomb fragment still clinging to the arbor behind the refectory. Rumors spread faster than the abbot could quell them. Some claimed Cadfael had been carried off by a forest spirit, perhaps the same phantom who rattled chains by the northwest corridor. Others whispered that he'd discovered a dark secret in the library stacks and paid the price. A few more practical souls suspected he'd simply slipped away, seeking freedom from monastic life, trading his robe for a traveler's cloak. Days turned to weeks. Candles were left burning at Cadfael's empty stall. Monks placed small bouquets of lavender at the chapter house door. Pilgrims saw his cell's window shuttered, a rope hastily tied across it. The abbot prayed for his safe return. The infirmarian prepared poultices in case he'd fallen ill, and the brewmaster quietly reserved a mug of ale in his honor each mealtime. Then came the first sign, a tattered scrap of parchment, pinned under a fallen chestnut leaf near the northern gate. Written in Cadfael's neat hand were just 3 words, more to learn. No signature, no date. It vanished from abbey custody the very next night, by a hand no one saw. Over months, subtle indicators emerged. A wandering minstrel spoke of a mad monk trading herbal remedies in a distant market town. A merchant's letter mentioned a peddler fitting Cadfael's description, selling rare bee balm and speaking in gentle verse. Yet every time monks tracked such leads, the trail went cold. Empty hives, abandoned herb satchels, and a lingering echo of his soft whistle. Within the abbey, life continued, but a wound remained. The novices, once boisterous during late-night snack raids, now tiptoed past the refectory at vespers, expecting to glimpse Cadfael's empty bench. The candlelit processions felt thinner without his steady presence. Even the bees seemed quieter in spring, as though mourning their keeper. Speculation took on mythic dimensions. Some insisted Cadfael had joined a secret order of wandering healers, sworn to roam until all creation was cured. Others told of his meeting with a hermit who taught him forbidden screen magic, an art beyond the rule, capable of healing or harm. A few junior monks left tiny apothecary jars on the altar steps, believing their brother's spirit still tended to crushed leaves and poultices. Yet the abbot forbade martyr worship. He reminded the community that stability was sacred, that running away, even in search of knowledge, risked eternal unrest. He relegated any mention of Cadfael's disappearance to private prayer, forbidding public speculation. Trust in providence, he would say, eyes quiet with sorrow. Decades later, when the abbot's bones rested beneath the chapter house floor, the lavender still grew wild along the monastery walls. New novices heard the tale of the vanished monk as cautionary lore. Follow the rule, or discover more to learn, beyond its walls, never to return. But some brothers, who remembered Cadfael's gentle teaching hand and the hum of his bees, believed his spirit lingered where curiosity and faith intersected. In the herb garden at dawn, one might catch a faint whistle on the breeze. And if you looked closely, you might see footprints where none should be, tiny indentations around the hidden beehives, as though a man walked softly on petals. Cadfael's story remains unsolved, a sacred mystery woven into the abbey's memory. He vanished at vespers, leaving behind hope, sorrow, and the promise that some truths demand sacrifice, perhaps even the greatest sacrifice of all, one's place in the known world. The chapter house is empty now, sunlight filtering through the high windows in soft, warming rays. The echoes of chants have faded. replaced by a gentle breeze that stirs the lavender outside. Here, in this quiet hush, you can feel the day's cares slipping away, like petals carried down a calm stream. Let the tension of our journey ease, each breath softening the memories of candlelit mischief and hidden feasts. Imagine the abbey now at rest, the iron chains on the library shelves resting quietly, the brewery vats cooling in the corner, and the scuffed stone floors, once swept in frantic panic, smoothing under the touch of morning light. The air holds a promise of peace, of stability, carried from Velocta's rule to our own hearts. Close your eyes to the past's echoes, and let the hush fill the space within you. In this moment, the stories of secret love letters, midnight mischief, and vanished monks become gentle lullabies. Each tale, vivid under candle glow, now drifts into stillness. You might hear a faint rustle of parchment or the soft hum of a bee, but only as tender reminders that life's greatest marvels often hide in whispers. Let them settle, soft as dust, around your thoughts. Rest here, among the ancient stones and the scent of lavender. Feel every corner of your mind relax rights and wrongs, vows kept and broken, saints and sinners all melting into one quiet tapestry of humanity. Trust that, like the monks, you too can find comfort in routine, find joy in small rebellions, and discover that even within structure, the heart can wander freely. Now, as the final light fades, carry this calm with you. The Abbey's hush is yours, a gentle companion for whatever dreams await. Sweet dreams, and may you awake refreshed, ready for new stories to unfold tomorrow or the next quiet night.